when we, Rabbi Klinger, myself, and Steve Smith were, talking about this, planning it, we call it the Gedolim series, because there are just so many that individuals that are really the greatest of our generation, and they've been lost during this time, and it's a huge loss, not just for the Jewish people, but for the world. So, that's why we saw fit, now hitting the anniversary of when all of this started, to be able to perpetuate their lives through the legacy that they've left with us and that they leave. And that's really what the Living Torah Fund is all about. That's why we named it the Living Torah Fund, perpetuating legacy through learning, because as we know, right, tzaddikim b'misasan even nikru chaim, the righteous people, righteous men and women, even in their deaths, are considered alive because of what they leave behind, because of what they've taught us, because of what we learn from them. The reason why we celebrate or commemorate yahrzeits as opposed to birthdays, for the most part, it's yahrzeits, because a birthday is a clean slate. What have you done? What have you accomplished? It's very nice. It's a nice day, but the yahrzeit of a person really speaks to what they've left behind, and we have such rich legacies in the individuals that we're specifically in this series remembering and commemorating and learning about and learning from. But there are so many. Unfortunately, there were so many to choose from, because we've lost so many and so much by way in the Torah world and the Jewish world during this period. So, Erica is going to be introduced by Rabbi Klinger, and she was a very special student of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, and she'll be giving some of his interpretations, some of her own interpretations on the Haggadah, but again, sparking us to be in that space of memory and legacy. And going forward, next week, we'll be commemorating the life of the Novominsker Rebbe, whose yahrzeit is 1 year yahrzeit is right around this time. He was a cousin of mine. He's a cousin, a mishpacha of Rabbi Nassim Mahler, who will be presenting on him, and Izzy Rubenstein, Rabbi Rubenstein, Zichrono Livracha, the Rabbi and Debbie's yahrzeit, also coming up in a Shabbos from now. Izzy's going to be on this in the beginning to talk about a connection that the Morgensterns Rubensteins had with the Sokolov Rebbe, who the Novominsker Rebbe is related to as well. And following Pesach, we'll be hearing about, again, the life and legacy of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. And following that, some great halachic giants, Rabbi David Feinstein, Rav Zalman Nehemiah Goldberg, and Gedalia Dov Schwartz. And then rounding out the series, we'll be remembering Rabbi Norman Lamb and all that he leaves behind. So we really thought of no better person to start us off and bring the momentum forward than Erica. And I'd like to ask Rabbi Klinger to please introduce Erica. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi. Our esteemed guest for this evening, Dr. Erica Brown, is the director of the Mayberg Center for Jewish Education and Leadership and an associate professor of curriculum and pedagogy at the George Washington University. Erica was a Jerusalem Fellow, is a faculty member of the Wexner Foundation, an Avichai Fellow, and the recipient of the 2009 Covenant Award for her work in education. She's the author of 12 books on leadership, the Hebrew Bible, and spirituality. Her newest book is the Book of Esther, Power, Fate, and Fragility in Exile. And she has been published in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Tablet, First Things, and the Jewish Review of Books, and wrote a monthly column for the New York Jewish Week. She has blogged for Psychology Today, for Newsweek, Washington Post's On Faith, and JTA, and tweeted on one page of Talmud study a day at drericabrown.com. Check it out. And she doesn't want me to go on because I'm making her blush too much. And without further ado, she's incredible. I gave you a snippet of her bio. She is so accomplished, so amazing, so incredible, and a very talented educator, and it is our great pleasure to turn over to her for the rest of this night.
Okay, thank you.
Brown?
Thank you, Rabbi Klinger. It's good to see you, Rabbi Morgenstern. It's lovely to be in your shul. I look forward to being there in person. It has been a hard year of loss of so many special rabbis. I just lost Rabbi Avraham Twersky as well, was a great loss and a bit of a personal loss as I had a relationship with him and also my own rabbi growing up, Rabbi Sidney Goldstein of blessed memory, died this year, and so there's so many important figures in my world that have passed away this year and leave such rich legacies. I could tell I was coming to a Jewish event because your passcode was 181818, which also, if you want to break into my house, it's 613. So I feel in some kinship, some numerical kinship with you, to begin a conversation about Rabbi Sachs. And the thing is with Rabbi Sachs is that however immense his thinking was, his conceptual framing, the wide sweeping philosophical lens that he had for things, and you think, wow, he's just cited a lot of books, and he's so well read, and he's so accomplished, and he has this beautiful accent, and he whatever you saw was really the surface of him, and I became aware of that as a student of his. In 1988, I moved to England. My husband is English. He was finishing medical school. I didn't even know how to drive. I had to learn stick shift on the other side of the road. And my world was pretty narrow because I didn't know how to drive. And I lived right near Jews College, where Rabbi Sachs was at the time, we called the principal of Jews College before he became the chief rabbi. And I really didn't know anything. I mean, I was 21. I didn't know anything about life. I didn't speak English properly. At least they thought so. And all of a sudden, I meet in this very, very small college. It was a part of University of London, but it was a very small building in a suburb. And I meet this absolute giant of a man, very gentle, very thoughtful. And he would teach, and the room would be on fire. It was a small group of students. London does not have a large population, and it had an even smaller population of people who were doing serious work in Judaic studies. And I was teaching at the college at the time, and only a year into my stay did I decide I really needed to do a master's, and he was my thesis advisor. I need to learn everything I can from this man. And I would go from, he would speak in various shuls, and I would attend and hear his lectures. And then I got the privilege of teaching very often in his shul in Marble Arch, where we'd go for many Shabbatot and holidays. And Lady Elaine was in my own class in Jews College. And so I felt a certain, I can't say closeness because there was an intellectual distance, and there was a sense of magic about Rabbi Sachs always that created certain kinds of barriers for any student. But I did have opportunities to speak with him in his home. He had a shed in the back of his house, the infamous garden shed, and that's where he would do his reading. His brother, who I spoke with, his brother Alan, at length after Rabbi Sachs died, his brother Alan claims that he read a book a day. And I think that's probably accurate. I have no reason to not believe him. And you kind of wonder what makes an extraordinary figure like Rabbi Sachs. Of course, his intellectual gifts and his education at some of the best universities in the world. But there was also a sense of something extraordinary about him from his youth. And Alan describes going on vacation with him to the beach, and he wore a tweed jacket and a bow tie. So you sort of can imagine something about him that communicated that he wasn't really of this world in a lot of ways. And I think that you feel that in his writing. He would describe his writing methods to me as locking himself in what he would call a summer trance. He would write most of his books in the summer, the bulk of the books, and he would enter this deep world with his piles of books, and he would begin to chart certain territory that he felt if you read any of his books, you know that he was always on trend. He cared a lot about poles and research and evidence and sociology and economics. And so these came together for him in his writing as he thought about the major trends of the day and what he needed to say about them, and what Judaism had to say about them, and how he might direct them. In fact, he was called the moral voice of Britain. He served in the House of Lords long after we had left London. And he had, and as a teacher, I actually saved this little, you could see the Jews College London. I didn't make it up. This was from July 16th, 1990. And really, it was to Rabbi Sachs's credit that I went on to write my doctorate, because he said, I do hope that you will go on to write a doctorate, among other things. And I think that early encouragement from him, and without ever feeling from him that there was a difference between his male or female students, he didn't make those kind of distinctions. I never felt in any way religiously, spiritually, intellectually inferior, although I can't say that was true in general in English culture at the time, where I was a bit of a fish out of water in many ways. There was something very embracing about his humanity and his thinking. It's almost as if he was a product of where he was, and he was also so much larger. Now, the Haggadah is important. If you've read his Haggadah, you know how just magnificent and beautiful it is. But part of the beauty of his Haggadah is the introduction. And in the introduction to the Haggadah, he lays out the cornerstone of thinking that he's done through all of his many books. I actually have, I don't have it here, but I have the copy of his first book, and it's an edition actually that didn't go ahead there was some problem with the cover. So it's actually like a bootlegged edition of his first book. And Rabbi Sachs, even there, he began a trajectory of thinking that became amplified as he aged, and as his thought evolved, and as society became more and more foreign and alien to him. He talks in the introduction of his Haggadah about the importance of family and the institution of family. For those of you who've read his last book, Morality, he talks about the breakdown of the family, the pervasive virus of loneliness, the I versus the we society. These were themes that he was writing about in the 80s, right? These were things that he had been thinking about. But of course, with the rise of social media, he understood that it took an even darker turn. And what he saw in the Haggadah and in Pesach generally was the home holiday that was cementing the primacy of the family as the place where all learning begins, and in many ways where one's learning returns. And so the table for him, the Pesach Seder table, was where all of Judaism came together. It was memory, it was history, it was continuity, it was family. These were all the ingredients that made for the kind of Judaism that he believed was a gift to the world. And he, as a spokesperson of faith in the world, which in many ways took him far outside the bounds of the smaller Jewish community in London, and became a voice for the English Commonwealth generally, and in the English-speaking world. I always say when he stopped being the chief rabbi of the United Synagogues of England, he became the chief rabbi of the English-speaking world. And in so many ways, he was trying to take these values and show why they're still relevant, and show them as solutions to contemporary problems. What interests me always is, how does one become someone like Rabbi Sachs, right? And it's like, what do you have to read? How much do you have to write? How much do you have to think? Who do you need to be around? And so for those of you who've done any reading in Rabbi Sachs's own life, and I have to say, one of my great sadnesses is that he never wrote a memoir. I'm sure it wouldn't be something that he'd feel comfortable doing, but I think that it would have given a lot of us insight into his path. And so I want to actually look at his path in relation to Moshe's path as we think about the Pesach story. I also want to say that many of you know that Rabbi Sachs came to the United States, and he met the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who had an enormous impact on him, as well as many central figures in the American Jewish community, asking them questions before he became a rabbi, sort of thinking about what were the issues, or on his way to becoming a rabbi, what were the issues that he needed to talk about? What does it mean to have a platform? How do you move people and motivate people? What are the philosophical conundrums? So this is a person who created readiness for an experience by a careful process of curiosity and exploration and research. And so, what I want to suggest is that all of us at Pesach have an opportunity to take a similar trajectory, a similar journey. We might not get to the same result, but I think that in thinking about what that journey is to excellence, to wholeness, to creativity, we can sort of capture something very profound about the Pesach story. So, with your permission, Does anyone have any questions yet? You can save them. You're welcome to put questions in the chat. I'm not so coordinated, so I don't always read and figure things out at the same time. We're going to go to our shared screen, and I want to talk about a quote by an author and look at a painting and think about the readiness for redemption in terms of thinking about what it means to prepare a leader for a role. So Justina Chen says, there must be a few times in life when you stand at a precipice of a decision, when you know there will forever be a before and an after. And I think many of us know that, whether it was standing under the chuppah, whether it was bringing our first child home, whether it was putting in a college application or early decision somewhere, or receiving a letter about a job, that there's some moment where you have a conscious understanding that something transformative is on the horizon. You don't know what it is, but you hope that you're ready for it. And I want to point to this moment here in this painting, which is long and thin, right, on the horizontal front. So it's a slightly different composition to many who have painted this scene. And what you find is, on some level, this Moshe and the burning bush, Moses and the burning bush. You see, this is probably done in the late 1500s. And you have these sheep. And so it seems on one hand like a pastoral scene, and maybe the shepherd is leaning, reclining. And then you notice something in the corner of your eye. And that, I think, is very intentional. And the dimensions of the painting, I think, are intentional. You see some flames in the corner of your eye. And they reflect, in many ways, the flames. There's a certain arc of the flame that almost feels like it's going around Moshe's shoulder, which is where the artist has painted the light. And of course, you see Moshe's strong arm, and you see his bare foot as he sits kneeling. So we're going to take that into account, and we're going to read something from Rabbi Sax's Haggadah, something very small. To ask is to believe that somewhere there's an answer. We ask not because we doubt, but because we believe. And I think that's a really interesting posture of curiosity and wonder, that you want to know something and you ask a question because you assume there's an answer somewhere, and it might take me a lifetime to figure it out, but there's a mystery that has to unfold. And asking questions for Rabbi Sachs was not about doubt, it was about belief. And that's important in looking at both his life and also the life of Moshe. So in terms of readiness, let's talk about threshold moments. That before and after, right? That space right in between, that liminal space. This is from a friend of mine, Sherry Hirsch, who wrote a book, Thresholds. And she says, we spend a lot of time traversing the hallways and crossing the thresholds, both in our homes and in our lives. Moments when we're in transition, those moments when we're standing between the way we were accustomed to living and a new way of thinking, feeling, and being. Moments when we're preparing to enter a new room, to take the next step on the journey of our lives. These moments can be disorienting and scary, sometimes painful, or even heartbreaking. Other times they can be exciting, hopeful, filled with possibility. Why do some of us struggle to cross while others don't? So she casually used that word cross, but I want to think about what Passover is as a national crossing that will reflect in many ways Moshe's personal crossing. And so let's go to the readiness moment, the threshold moment of the Exodus story, and that takes us to Shemot Yud Bet. I'm just going to look at a few psukim. V'lakchu min adam v'natnu al shtei hamezuzot b'al hamashkof al habatim asher yochlu oto bahem. So we didn't talk about the beginning of the story. Of course, we're familiar with this. You take a sheep and you tie it to your doorpost, and when we're ready to go, when you're ready to take this immense journey, you're going to take the blood from it and you're going to put it on the mezuzot, right, on the doorpost and the lintel of these houses, where you're going to eat it. Now, the minute you do that, by the way, you know that the Egyptians revered sheep. That's why they wouldn't eat with Joseph and his brothers, who were shepherds. And so and Maimonides talks about this in Guide to the Perplexed, if you shecht a sheep and you kill the Egyptian god, and you do so publicly as to put blood on your doorposts, you have to leave. You're not wanted anymore. You're not tolerated anymore. And where do we put that blood? We put it on a threshold space. We put it on the most liminal space that we have, which is a door, right? A door representing an exit and an entrance, right? So leaving one life and entering the other, and the blood representing in some way the sacrifice and commitment and possible bloodshed that is going to be required to become a nation. So we do this symbolic putting of blood. And of course, the mezuzah represents that for us today. It represents thinking about this liminal space and understanding that when you go through a liminal space, usually you go through a door by yourself, right? It's even large doors, we tend to go through a singularly. So when you think about a door and you think about a mezuzah and you think about the shin, the shin of Shaddai, of God as protector, and the mezuzah as the Shema, and the cloth as the mission statement of the Jewish people, you're never going through that door alone. When you go through these doors of anxiety, where you're not sure if you're ready to take that next step, the message is you're not alone. And then, and after you do this, then you have to, right? V'kacha tochloto, and this is the way you're going to eat it. B'manechem chagurim na'alechem b'raglechem u'maklechem b'yadechem, right? Look, all that chem, right? V'achaltem oto b'chipazon pesach hu l'Hashem. And we tend to reflect on this word chipazon that comes up loads of divrei Torah about the crossing over and about the preparation, but less so about this idea of which to me is so symbolic in a text that's so economic of language, is gird your loins and put sandals on your feet and put a staff in your hand. In other words, it's takeout food, right? It's saying, I need you to do everything that you need to do to create readiness for a moment. And then it's Vavarti Be'eretz Mitzrayim. That's when the crossing happens. That's when the crossing over happens in that night. But prepare yourselves. Don't go into this experience physically and spiritually unaware of what you're doing. You need to think about the consequences of this and prepare yourselves for every. Now, it's true that you can never really prepare yourselves for a transformational moment, right? Because you can paint a nursery and you can have a registry and you can, right? But it doesn't really, and you read it, you can read about experiences of becoming a spouse and becoming a parent and becoming a graduate and becoming a professional. But until you're there, you'll never really know. And yet, still, we have to prepare. Whether it's 3 days of Avraham walking to Har Moriah, whether it's the 3 days that Yonah spends in a fish, the 3 days that Esther spends fasting, the 3 days that we spend in preparation at Sinai, we need some time to understand. And so, even though we're going to move very quickly on this night, there's still a pause that says, gird your loins, put on your sandals, and get ready. And actually, I think about this always. The mezuzah, as I've aged, has become a much more important mitzvah to me. I think because I recognize how many doors of possibility and opportunity get opened and also get shut within a lifetime. And so looking at the mezuzah and feeling that when those things happen, I'm not going through them alone, has been particularly important. And in fact, the first petach, the first sort of mashkof, the first experience of the liminal space, right? Because there's no space more liminal than a door. We find actually early in Sefer Bereshit, in Genesis, where Cain is very, very angry, and God interrogates him. And he says, "Lama charalach v'lama naflu fanecha?" Why are you so upset? Why is your face fallen? And he gives him a message about the Petach experience, the threshold moment. He says, "Hello, im tetiv se'et." Isn't it true that if you do good, you'll be uplifted? V'im lo tetiv, and if not, lepetach chatat rovetz ve'elecha tshukato v'atat timshal bo. He says, I need to tell you something. You're going to have lots of times in your life when your anger, when your fury will boil over, when you want to act on impulse. And he says, I need you to know something. If you do good, you'll be uplifted. And if you want to do bad, it doesn't say you'll do bad. It says, know that the seduction will pounce on you. It's just at the door, right? It's at the petach and it's ready to jump. But you also need to know something. You will desire it, but you can overcome it and you can be stronger. Now, Cain couldn't understand the threshold moment. He didn't understand what his feelings were, even though God tried to help him process it. Lama charalach. And he couldn't understand the feelings at the threshold. And therefore he went into the fields and he killed his brother. So let's think now, let's transition from that story, from Exodus 12 and Genesis 4, and let's take a look at the end of Devarim and go back to the very beginning of Moshe's story. So in the end of Devarim, as we know, V'lo kam navi od b'Yisrael k'Moshe asher yodo Hashem panim el panim. So there's never going to be another prophet like Moshe. If you had some aspirations in the Moshe prophetic department, sorry, Devarim has already told you that's not going to be possible for you. And I think in many ways, the death of Moshe gets a little bit of short shrift because we often reading it and as the close of one Sefer and the opening of Sefer Bereshit. And so it's hard. We're not really always good at exits. So sometimes we leave something too quickly. And here the text wants us to stay and not only think about Moshe's death, but Moshe's everlasting legacy, that he had this quality of speaking face to face. Right? It's only associated with Moshe, and maybe through our little study of him at the beginning of his life, as he creates readiness for this moment, will we understand the significance of the statement at the end. So let's talk Rabbi Joshua Heschel. Rabbi Heschel wrote a book, The Prophets, a 2-volume work, and his chapter, What Manner of Man is the Prophet, is probably been, in my own leadership work, probably been one of the most influential texts. And he talks about the difference between the way a prophet reacts to circumstances and the way an ordinary human being. And he says to us, a single act of injustice, cheating a business, exploitation of the poor, is a slight. To the prophets, a disaster. To us, injustice is injurious to the welfare of the people. To the prophets, it's a death blow to existence. To us, an episode. To them, a catastrophe, a threat to the world. And Rabbi Heschel described the prophet as someone who had large eyes, myopic eyes, so that he could see things that other people didn't want to see, and huge ears so that he'd hear things that other people didn't want to hear. Now, what's fascinating about this description is that for Rabbi Heschel, and his understanding of prophecy really is counter to the way that we think about the word prophet in common parlance. When we talk about prophets, we always think about fortune tellers. I grew up in Deal, New Jersey, and I used to, in order for me to walk to shul, to Rabbi Goldstein's shul, who I mentioned before, I walked on the boardwalk. Walked past the Stone Pony, just nodded to Bruce Springsteen, and past Madame Marie, which is the fortune teller that he popularized. And this idea of the prophet as fortune teller, as predictor of the future, is really very counter to the way that we understand our Hebrew prophets, right? Our prophets, it's not that they're looking at the future. It's they're looking intensely at the present, at things that other people don't want to look at, right? They want to pretend this doesn't exist. These trends don't exist. These activities, these crimes, these misdemeanors, that they want to just put them under the surface. The job of the prophet is actually to scrutinize the present. It's not to predict the future. And if you can scrutinize the present, you may be able to lay claims to a better future. But you have to point out people's behavior in the here and now. And now we go to Moshe with these Heschelian eyes. So let's look at, we start with Moshe's story. And I know that you've read the book, and I know that you've seen the movie. And maybe you've seen the, multiple movies about it, but I want to look at it with slightly different eyes. And I think that's actually the gift of the Torah, is to be able to look at something that's highly familiar and make it unfamiliar and then familiar again. So we begin the Moshe story very strangely, without knowing anything about Moshe's parents. Unlike Breshit, where everyone gets named almost, in this Sefer, Moshe will not get a name immediately upon his birth. His parents aren't named. His sister is not named. V'yelech ish mibeit Levi v'yikach et bat Levi. But there is a detail that we are told about Moshe, and that is that he was born to Levites. Now, Martin Buber, in his book on Moses, understands that Moshe goes to three households. He goes to the household, he comes from, or three leadership households in this chapter 2. The Levite, then Pharaoh, and then he will go on to Yitro, Kohen Midian, a Kohen's house. And for our intents and purposes, the Levi, Pharaoh, which is an honorific, it's not a proper name, and Kohen present three different models of what leadership can look like. And that for Moshe to really be mentored to the greatness that he became, he needed the exposure to different leadership models, or at least he benefited from the exposure of different leadership models. Of course, V'tahar Isha v'tiled ben, the woman is pregnant and she has a son. And of course, if you don't know the context of this, that's no big deal. It's just another story. But if you read chapter 1 and you know that there was a pronouncement that all of these male children who are born will be thrown in the river, the two words you'd say are oive, my guess is, but that is not what happens. V'tireh oto ki tovu. She sees that he is good. The Rashbam there, Shmuel ben Meir, Rashi's grandson, notes Kitov, takes us all the way back to Genesis, doesn't do much with it, but points out, Kitov appears there, almost as if that's telling a Genesis story, right? That's telling the story of the beginning of the world. This is the beginning of of nationhood for Israel. And there's something about the human capacity to see good in something that doesn't appear good, that is the hallmark of Jewish leadership. More than that, I want to think about this word v'tereh. She saw him. She saw him. Of course, every mother sees a child. Why do you need to? She saw him. She saw something in him, and that seeing, I'll say, is the seeing is actually the quality that she saw. She saw a seer, right? She turned to notice someone who had some extraordinary quality that would come out through his eyesight. And she hides him for 3 months, all right? And we're not going to, this text, when she couldn't hide him, she put him in the Nile. Of course, as many scholars point out, Moshe probably wasn't the only one in the Nile, right? There were probably baskets all over, because of course, what Jewish mother is throwing her child in the water, she'll find a Talmudic loophole. I'll put him in a basket and maybe someone will find him, which makes, of course, Pharaoh's daughter finding him all that more momentous. And V'titzav achoto merachok, his sister is, it says stationed, others translate it as she positioned herself, or she was positioned from a distance. L'de'ah ma yaselo. L'de'ah ma yaselo, to know what would happen to him. Pharaoh's daughter comes and she sees this child, right? And watch what happens. V'tereh et hateva. She sees this ark, right? She sees this little basket, and I say ark because it was made of similar materials to the ark itself. She sees this small ark, this small carrier of this child. V'tiftach v'tireu, she sees the child. Here there are two women who see something in this child, who take note of him, which will help him, or at least foreshadow for him, the capacity to look at other things, to take note of things that other people ignore. And of course, then Miriam, I call her the first chutzpah lady of the Bible, speaks to Pharaoh's daughter and says, and notice Pharaoh's daughter is also not named, shall I get you a nurse, right? And it was understanding that this child Perhaps she can do something to cement and grow this child into the one he will become. And she says yes, and he's taken and he's nursed. So he's brought up on Jewish mother milk and brought up to understand that he has an alternate family. And this can only be confusing and also stressful for him in his future life, as we will see. He gets named very strangely by Pharaoh's daughter. We don't know if he had another name beforehand, calling him after drawing him out of the water. And the water, of course, will be symbolic in so much of his life, his own capacity to pay forward the experiences of chapter 2 into every dimension of his future, right? To open up the seas of the of Yam Suf, to open those up for the Jews to cross over. Anyway, Vayhi b'yamim ha'em, in these days, Vigdal Moshe v'yitzei elachav, and he went out to his brethren. In other words, something we say in Hebrew, Moshech, he's pulled, he's drawn to his brothers. And he sees, Vayar b'sivlotam, he sees their suffering, meaning he looked at their suffering, that capacity to look carefully. Vayar ish mitzri, makeh ish ivri, mechav. And he looks at their collective suffering, but then he does something which really makes the justice hero. He looks at one act of suffering. We know that there are homeless people. We know there are people Holocaust survivors who are living in poverty. We read Federation brochures. We know people are hungry. We know people have needs. But then we tell the story of one person. So Moshe's video camera, if you will, narrows in and he sees this one person, and ish ivri mechav, v'yifen ko v'cho v'yar. And then he sees that he thinks no one is looking. He thinks he's the only one who sees. And he kills the Mitzri and he hides him in the sand, knowing perhaps, maybe that's just the act of instinct, that in this act of killing the Egyptian, he has, right, later on we will go kill the sheep, he has severed, quite figuratively and literally, he has severed his connection to Pharaoh and his palace. And then he sees two Hebrews fighting, and he says, why do you strike your fellow, right? In other words, as opposed to killing one of them, he says, these are my people, and I don't like the way my people are interacting. And then, of course, he hears what he would hear. Again, everything that happens in Moshe's life is foreshadowed in this chapter. Like, who made you chief and ruler over us? I'm the oldest child. I don't know if there's any other older children. My siblings would say, who made you the boss over us, right? And I imagine that some of you heard similar expressions, right? And he finds out, he realizes that people have seen, right? Do you mean to kill me, right? Kasher haragta et mitzri, the way that you've killed the Mitzri. Vayar Moshe, and again Moshe sees, Vayam achei noda davar. Remember how Miriam puts him somewhere so she could know what would happen to him? And now he knows what will happen to him. And he runs. And he flees. And he goes to Midian. And you know how the story goes and you know how the movie goes. He comes simply to a well scene. Robert Alter talks about wells as a wedding type scene in the Hebrew Bible. For us, I always say there's no wedding bells, they're wedding wells. And he sees that these women are being harassed. And Vayakam Moshe. At this point, he's a fugitive from the law. He wasn't known. He didn't have to make himself known. He simply cannot help himself. And the story ensues as we're familiar with. He goes back, and the father says, "Why are you home so early? We were rescued." And he says, why did you leave? He's a nice guy. Why did you bring him over? And Moshe comes and into the home. He eats. He gets a wife. So it was a wedding scene in the typical biblical wedding scene that we expected. And Moshe does something very strange. He names his son Gershom. This is like going to a bris. And I have to share with you that I had a grandson on Sunday, so we're going on Shabbat, and we're having a bris soon. Imagining my son getting up and naming a baby Gershom. Right now, Gershom, of course, is a popular name now, but at the time, to be able to say Ger Haiti Beretz Nachriya, I'm naming my child is dislocation, my child is alienation, my child is alone. It's a name of solitude. It's a name of pain. And we're not sure what pain he's talking about. Is it the pain, the ancestral pain? Is it the dislocation from his parental home? Is it the dislocation from Egypt because he's in Midian? Is it all of these layers of his experience of dislocation? And then we have a very strange ending. All of a sudden, our video camera moves far away from the Moshe story and this story of him naming his son. This king dies, and all of a sudden they're crying profoundly, the Israelites, and the word reaches God. And you're going, wait a minute. Why didn't this happen in chapter 1? V'yishma Elohim et naktam, v'yizkor Elohim et brito, et Abraham, et Yitzchak, et Yaakov. And suddenly, God hears everything. Vayar Elohim, and that verb comes up again. So we have Yochevet, Moshe's mother sees. Batya, his proto mother sees. Moshe sees, and then God sees. Right? All of these sight lines develop throughout this chapter. V'yeda Elohim, and then God knows. Miriam knows, Moshe knows, and then God knows. So I want to stop the share, and I want to think with you about this experience of seeing. Now that I've stopped the share, you have to actually pay attention because I'm here. So we're at this place of seeing, and we have this weird postscript. The last few psukim deal with the collective experience of the Israelites, and they're finally crying. Why weren't they crying before? So I spent some time in Boston. My husband was training, and I was doing my PhD there. And I had the zchut of being in Rav Soloveitchik's shul. And after Rabbi Soloveitchik passed away in Maimonides school, and his gender was there, and his name and his gender, and the beautiful gold, the cover, and stories always told in Divrei Torah about Rav Soloveitchik that were very meaningful. And there used to be these shiurim that he would give on Saturday night that were very popular. And there's a man in the shul who had the cassette tape collection. Some of you may not know what a cassette tape is, but I remember the cassette tapes. So anyway, I knew that he liked me when after a few years he said, Erica, I have a cassette tape for you. So I listened to a cassette tape of Rav Soloveitchik. I think it was a 4-hour, it was many hours of teaching. It was very, very beautiful. And he asked this question, and I want to share the answer with you because I think it's lyrical and I think it really speaks volumes about his insight and his literary reading of this chapter. He said, why is it that Bnei Israel don't cry in the first chapter and they only cry in the end of chapter 2 and then God hears them? If they cried in chapter 1, then God could have heard them and God could have saved them earlier. This is what Rav Soloveitchik says, and this is the process of redemption. That is the title of tonight's talk. He says that until there was a Moshiach, until there's a savior on the scene, people don't express their pain. He says, and if you don't understand that, go on a playground and watch little children. A child is playing on the swing, on a slide. Child falls off the slide and looks. If someone is looking at me, it's worth a gazunta cry. And if no one is looking at me, I'm going to pick myself up. I'm going to, take the wood chips off of my trousers, and I'm going back on the slide. In other words, when no one is there to hear you, at a certain point, you become numb to your own pain, or you learn to live with it by absorbing it and moving on. And so what Rav Soloveitchik says is even though Bnei Israel did not have a real formal introduction to Moshe as savior, simply the fact that there was someone associated with the palace who was willing to kill an Egyptian taskmaster gave them the capacity to cry. And when they cried, it gave God the means to save them. When someone doesn't ask for help, we don't know the help that they need. But when they cry, it's the beginning of the redemptive process. And what he says about Moshe is that Moshe had the capacity. He took people from the silence, right? The silence of chapter 1, the animalistic cry that they elicit in chapter 2, to the articulation of tefillah, of zakah, of tefillah, of Moshe's shalach et ami, and then the majestic experience of release, the shirah of Exodus 15. That is what a leader does. That is what a redeemer does. A redeemer takes people from silence to song and all of the stages in between. A redeemer gives people the capacity to understand their pain. And that's something a lot of people don't appreciate, is that in order for you to experience redemption, you have to be in touch with your pain and name your pain. Otherwise, you never really deal with your pain. People who medicate to get through a funeral, to get through a tragedy, often never get over the tragedy because they don't go through that tunnel of grief that's necessary and name it so that they can actually be redeemed. And so I think this very beautiful insight helps us understand a capacity that Moshe had and that great leaders have throughout time. They give words to the silence. They allow us to experience our pain, and they take us to a place of song. So I want to go back. I'm going to go back to our screen share. And I want to look at another thing that's important in this story. So what we see in this story, hold on, I got to just charge up a little bit. I don't want to lose you. That would be just a terrible Zoom problem. In this chapter, we see something about Moshe that we don't see about Avraham. We don't know why Avraham was chosen. The Rambam does this beautiful job in the first 2 chapters of Hilchot Avodah Zarah explaining why why Avraham was chosen as a leader. We don't have that in the text, but here we're given these 3 instances of Moshe's, to use a colloquialism, his social justice, his incapacity to be in the presence of injustice and not do anything about it. But that is not enough. It is not enough to be a social justice warrior. And I'm always careful in non-Orthodox teaching to make this point, because sometimes people, l'taken olam b'malchut Shaddai, you forget the malchut Shaddai. You think about the tikkun olam without this larger understanding of the Mosaic legacy of leadership. We get to, I want to, in order to look at this, I wanted to look at something that Nachum Sarna says. He says 3 incidents in Moshe's life occurred while he was still attached to the palace, are given prominence in the narrative because they reveal aspects of his character and disclose his commitments. And you see them. This outrage against decency and human dignity spontaneously arouses in him feelings of anger and resentment. And his instinctive indignation at the maltreatment of his brethren has effectively overcome his self-interest. And again, he cannot remain indifferent. Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg says in her beautiful book, Moshe, Human Life, when Moshe speaks on behalf of Israel, he acts as a proxy voice, amplifying and supplementing their inchoate sounds. In this role, he is forgiven for his irreverent tone. He's recognized for a new genre of expressiveness. He lends vitality to the people's inertia. He's not of them, nor is he like them. He's separate from them, reared in a different world, and yet he is in some uncanny relation with them that allows him to give voice to their despair. God strikingly responds, I too have heard the na'aka of the Israelites, as though to say, you're not the only one to care about the fragility. She points to the audio aspect, I pointed to the visual aspect that Moshe sees and then God sees. And once Moshe has given voice to their strangled cries, then God declares himself his ally and sympathy. But of course, this isn't the only part of the Moshe story that's significant. When Moshe was a ro'eh, right? Another sort of typical biblical scene. And he's moving the flock, v'yanhag et, right? Notice v'yanhag as the term of leadership, manhig, that we use today. He's moving this sheep, achar midbar, into the midbar, v'yavo el har Elohim choreva. So of course, he's at the edge of a mountain, and that mountain experience will be so critical in his future. Vayar malach Hashem elav, and a malach of God, a messenger of God, appears to him, b'libat esh mitoch hasneh vayar. And Moshe saw. V'hinei hasneh bo'er ve'esh v'hasneh anenu kal. He sees this wondrous thing. But wait. Vayomer Moshe, asra na ver'eh et hamar'eh hagadol hazeh. So here we go. Moshe turns from his, whatever he's doing, his work. In other words, this isn't right in front of him. He turns to see it. Hamar'eh hagadol. Look at the word ra'ah, right? This great seeing. And he asked, Madua, we've seen that word before. Madua lo yiva'er asneh. Why doesn't this burn up? So again, Moshe's sight, his vision, his question, right? His capacity for curiosity, and his understanding. I need to know this. But watch what happens next. Vayar Hashem. When Moshe sees, God sees. Vayar Hashem kisar lirot. V'yikra elav Elohim mitoch hasneh. Vayom Moshe Moshe vayom hineni. To me, everyone talks about hineni and Moshe. I want to look at the beginning of this. What did God see? God saw this is the type of person who turns to see. I want a person not only who fights justice, and I'm not going to say that fighting justice is a dime a dozen. We need a lot of fighters of justice. But God says that alone is not enough. There's another test. I want to know if you have that unique combination that is so rare to find of someone who finds all injustice intolerable and can stand back in a state of wonder and mystery and turn from whatever it is you're doing and say, something amazing has happened here. What we find in Moshe was that unbeatable combination. And had he only one and not the other, perhaps he would have saved and continued with his work on behalf of others, but it would have been looking at those like him and not looking up at God, that relationship that's so fundamental to the tensions in Moshe's life between his fidelity to God and his fidelity to his people, but also this sort of beautiful nexus, this intersection of these qualities that we find in Moshe that become apparent in other great leaders, those that you'll study in this series, those that you have running your own shul, and my own experience of Rabbi Sachs. What made Rabbi Sachs so incredible was not only that he was a person who was prepared to look and discuss and describe and analyze things that a lot of us weren't paying attention to, or had enough of, heard enough of, but he kept drumming them home. The importance of covenant as opposed to contract, the importance of the we and instead of the I, the importance of the ethical high bar, the attention that he paid to anti-Semitism and its rise in Europe. He looked at all of those things, but he also always looked heavenward. He always wore yellow ties when he could, because he wanted to make people happy. And he was actually a very, very joyous person, which sometimes you don't put in, when you think about Moshe, you don't always think about Moshe smiling. I hope that Moshe smiled at the moment at the sneh. But I think when I think about Rabbi Sachs, is his capacity for joy was mixed with that intense intellectual understanding that he had of the world and the curiosity that he had of the world. And so I want to leave you with that thought, because I think it's a legacy. And when Moshe dies, by the way, in Devarim Lamed Daled, it says there were two capacities that he had that weren't taken: his strength and his vision. We lost Rabbi Sachs so many years before his time. And I must share with you, when he died, I cried for really weeks. I would stop sometimes at a light. I would answer the door, and I don't know. I would start weeping. It's very, very hard to lose an influential teacher in your life and a role model. But I do believe that his legacy is important for all of us. The legacy of vision and the legacy of strength, the capacity to see what other people aren't prepared to see, and not only injustice, but to also look carefully at wonder and to feel awed and inspired by it. We are going to have a transformative experience in a few weeks. We are going to recreate that experience of the mashkof, of passing over. Are we ready? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erica. That was amazing. And mazel tov on your grandson.
Thank you.
May he grow up to be a gadol b'Yisrael like his parents.
Amen. Amen.
Baruch Hashem. Yeah, I also, I wasn't a student of Rabbi Sachs. We had him at the shul actually a couple of times with the help of Steve and some others, and he was an amazing human being. Every time I thought about him for the first couple of weeks, I couldn't talk about it, and I'm starting to tear up again because it's just a tremendous loss for the world. So again, thank you.
Yeah.
And I also want to just bring a full circle. Someone had called me about this, and I was thinking about it. Beverly Rosenbaum called me about this, and I was thinking about it today as well. That 13 years ago, it was 2008. Erica, you were scheduled to be our UJA speaker for Scholar in Residence Shabbos. After that was when we did live events. And it was right after the Rabbi Rubenstein and Debbie passed away, Zichronam Livracha. And I was like barely, I don't know, I was in a fog at that point, but I remember it. I remember it very well.
I remember that Shabbos, and I remember walking into Beverly's wonderful home, and the depth and the weeping and the loss, and as a shul, you've just really traveled far, and I want to thank Beverly for her hospitality. My friend Adina Fredman is here. I want to just acknowledge it's so nice to learn with you all, and it's really been a pleasure for me to spend some time with you, and I hope we can live a little bit of Rabbi Sachs's legacy and bring it to our Pesach tables, and more importantly, take that legacy and bring it to our children. Our children need to fight injustice, and our children need to appreciate moments of wonder, and they need to see us doing that. That's the work
Amen.
of the world.
With a smile.
With a smile.
Amen. This is what the Living Torah Fund is all about. This is what it's capable of. If you want to donate to the Living Torah Fund to support more incredible programs, to hear Erica Brown, Emir Hashem, more in our community, both virtually and, God willing, in person.
Present. Next time, it's Panim El Panim.
Amen. Amen. Ken Yehi Ratzon. You could speak to Steve, Ari Kefetz, or Sarah Ader. Thank you, everyone, so much. Chag kosher v'sameach. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you.
Take care.
Good night. Good night.
Bye-bye.